who is the founder of Neurologics.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming. Not for me, but for this wonderful human. I have known Claudia since graduate school, not in person, but like this. And for me, and I said this when Claudia asked me to write something about her book, she was the first person who could put into words that there was a name for families like mine. And I had no idea as a 28-year-old human that alcoholic family systems were a real thing. I grew up in a country club family where it looked perfect from the outside, and I was the overperformer. And I thought that was just a normal thing to be, and had zero framework to put that into any kind of intellectual capacity or to do any of that homework to heal myself before I worked with others. And so for me, it was absolutely amazing to meet Claudia more than a decade ago and to understand kind of her own journey and what went into not just the book that I read in grad school, but all of the books that have come since. It truly is such a great honor to introduce you to one of my personal heroes, Dr. Claudia Black.
Hello, everybody. I'm actually going to sit down. I'm not quite sure why I'm going to sit down. You're all standing up, but I might be here for a little bit, so I'm going to sit down here. And I am aware that many of you are not familiar with me, such as Karen is, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my history before I get into talking about books. But I really want to thank you for coming, and I want to thank Neurologics, and hopefully in the time you're here, if you're not as familiar with Neurologics, then you'll certainly talk to multiple people who work for Neurologics here today, so please learn more about what it is that they do. And I'll tell you a little bit more also about the work that I do other than just to write books. And so I started, I'm a social worker by profession. I have a PhD in social psychology. But as a very young social worker, I was free from a marriage, a very short marriage. I married a high school sweetheart. And I had just finished graduate school, and I was sort of looking for an adventure. And I had taken a job in an addiction treatment program. This was back in the 70s. And back then, we did not yet use the word addiction. We did not yet use the word chemical dependency even, so that sort of tells you. Back then, you worked in an alcohol treatment program or a drug treatment program. I had my only professional experience at that time was working with young girls, very angry girls, in residential treatment programs, and I really thought after graduate school I loved it. I loved residential work, and I loved really angry girls. I did. And I think that I really loved them because I was not that angry girl, and I had every reason in the world to be very angry. And they had a voice that I didn't have, and I think that was really the attraction. And I've always said for years that your angry kids and impaired families are probably closer to speaking the truth than your quiet ones, and your overachieving responsible ones like Karen and myself. And so when I got out of graduate school, it was so odd, but there was a course on alcoholism in graduate school, and again, you barely see that today, and so back then that was a real rarity. But it was in that class that I understood for the first time in my life what had happened in my life, that my father wasn't crazy. It wasn't about growing up with poverty, that he was just alcoholic, just. But it explained the craziness and the bizarreness of my whole life. And I grew up in a small town. My parents owned the only tavern in this town. So I grew up sitting at the bar, because that's, if I wanted to visit my mom, because she worked there, that's where I spent my time. So I had an alcoholic father. I spent a lot of time around particularly alcoholic men in the tavern, and I loved them. I mean, you know, I could sort of see beyond. You know, I wasn't the kid being neglected at their home, as I said, for hours. So when I got out of graduate school and I had taken this course, I thought, well, you know, there's two groups you can work with in residential treatment at that time. Angry girls or boys, and these people who were alcoholic. And I had a great compassion for them. As I said, you know, I love them. So I ended up taking my very first job in an addiction alcoholism treatment program. I knew nothing, absolutely nothing. But I convinced them that they needed to hire me when they didn't have a job. I told them they needed somebody under the age of 40. They needed a female. It didn't hurt that they had a non-recovering person. And then when he said he didn't have a job, and I knew he didn't have a job ahead of time, I did something that I don't know where I found the courage to do, but I forgot to get up. And I think I made this, what was then older man, who's probably 45 now, I think I made him so uncomfortable that he offered me a part-time job. He just created a job on the spot. So that's how I began my work. And he truly didn't have a job, but he worked for a corporation based out of Newport Beach here. And one day, weeks later, not months, a regional manager came through and they needed an MSW in an addiction treatment program here in California. And they offered me a full-time job. Well, as I said, it was really sort of a lark. I felt free for the first time in my life. And so I came to Southern California. And I wasn't real fond of Southern California. I was out in the valley in the LA basin. And they talked about their mountains. Well, I'm from the Pacific Northwest. They knew nothing about mountains. Lots of smog and 100,000 people at the beach. And I told myself, give yourself a year. In that year, being young and naive, as a social worker, they needed a family program. I didn't ask questions. You learn not to ask questions in alcoholic homes. You make assumptions. I thought family meant kids. They really only wanted one group once a week for the partner. That's all they wanted, but they didn't tell me that. So being very young and naive, I invited kids in. And I had little 4- and 5-year-old kids showing up, and I had 12, 13-year-old kids showing up. And back then, the people who tended to go to addiction treatment tended to be older. So I had a lot of 25, 30, 35-year-old adult kids showing up. And I didn't know quite what to do with them, so I put them in a group. And then what I saw in front of me was a progression, an emotional progression, in terms of from the difference between that 4-year-old and the 9-year-old, the 9-year-old and the 14-year-old. And then, you know, by the time they were 30 years of age, where the problems were much more blatant in their lives, but no longer connecting to addiction. So with that progression, I actually did that very early pioneering work around children of addiction, children of alcoholics, and would set the foundation and the naming of that phenomena of adult children of addiction. That catapulted my career. Back then, the Phil Donahue show, some of you are too young to remember Phil Donahue, who preceded Oprah Winfrey. A Newsweek magazine article on my work. So at a very young age, I had a lot of visibility. Over the course of the years, I have always kept my hands in residential treatment. In all that visibility, I began to do a lot of speaking that would ultimately change the addictions field and do a lot to influence the mental health field. And because when you work with families affected by addiction, you're working with depression, you're working with anxiety, you were working with trauma. We didn't have the language of trauma, nor did we have the neuroscience of trauma at that point, but we understood the impact of the trauma, and that's what we were working with as adult children. Because of doing so much of the speaking that I was doing, it didn't work for me to do outpatient psychotherapy, but I could always have my hands in an inpatient program, more as a consultant, and still go into groups and still have access to, you know, what's happening in people's lives and learning from them. And you know, that's what makes my heart soar, is walking into a group today to say something about that. So to make a very lifelong autobiography, somewhat shorter here, I became well known, and back in the 90s, the Meadows treatment program, an inpatient treatment program in Arizona that was internationally known. People came from all over the country to go to the Meadows. It's psychiatrically licensed. They treated people with mental health issues and addiction issues. And in essence, they always looked at underlying trauma. And again, language wasn't necessarily used in that way, but that's what they were looking at. They approached me and asked me if I would consult for them and to really come into their program and to take a look at what they were doing to see how I might influence that. That was back in 1998. This is the longest consulting job I had it up the other day. I think that's 26 years. I mean, if you know somebody who's consulted longer than me, I don't know, but for the one same group. I've always worked for myself because I found that to do the work I wanted to do around families impacted by addiction in particular, I needed to be on my own. And it's worked very well for me. So since 1998, I've consulted to the Meadows, and I worked a lot in their family program. And ultimately, I would help create the structure for their outpatient, look at their evening programs, weekend programs. But approximately 9 years ago, they realized they had 20% of their clients were young, under the age of 30, and they were causing behavioral problems, just imagine. And they were sort of angry kids. So nothing was better. They decided to move them to a different campus, and they said to me, can you help design this program? Which I was thrilled to do, and then a year later they said, can we attach your name to it? So today what I do professionally is I oversee, I always say my job is to maintain the clinical integrity of the Claudia Black Young Adult Center at the Meadows. Today the Meadows has specialty programs. We have a sex addiction program, gentle path, an intimacy program, Willow House. We have an eating disorder program. We have a retreat center. We have the young adult center. So it's very large. We have ILPs in all parts of the country, except for Orange County and LA. But so they came to me, the Meadows came to me approximately, it was 2 years ago in March. They called me, the CEO called me up and he said, Claudia, most treatment centers have a book about them. And we would like a book. And we would like you to consider writing that book. I said, what do you want the book to look like? They said, we have no idea. But I have written to this book. I had written 16 previous books, so I can write a book. But I've always written about something that I think has not been said before, or said in the way in which I want it said. And so this was a different kind of invitation. And so I gave some thought, and then we did some problem solving on the telephone. And so what I decided to do was, one of them said to me, you're good at storytelling. And when I speak, I'm a public speaker, I've been doing that for years, and I do tell good stories. And so when he said, you're good at storytelling, I thought, okay, I need to use stories. He wants stories. So I made the ultimate decision to go to alumni and garner stories from people who've been through various parts of the Meadows programs over the years. And then we have a lot of people associated to the Meadows, such as myself, maybe not quite as hands-on inside as much as maybe with trainings for our staff, such as Bessel Vanderkolk, Peter Levine, Larry Heller, Tion Dayton, Kevin McCauley, Patrick Carnes. I think there's about 12 of us. So I decided I would use them for some commentary. And that what I wanted to write about was, I wanted to write a book for the layperson. Every one of my books, not every one, nearly every one of my books is written for the layperson. It's my belief that I can write a book to a person who's struggling with something, and you, the psychotherapist, will learn from it. If I write the book for you, the psychotherapist, they don't, what they get out of it is what you learn and implement. But again, I find this, for me, is an empowering process to write like this. And so I wrote this book for the layperson, and I decided to write about the issues that people end up in psychotherapy for. So we have a chapter on eating disorders, we have a chapter on depression, I have a chapter on substance use disorders, intimacy disorders, sex addiction, a chapter related to the family. But the Meadows position is, with all of these issues, we have underlying trauma. So when I wrote the book, we have so many good books about trauma today. I thought, I'm not gonna say a lot about what trauma is and talk about the neuroscience. So I did somewhat of a brief first chapter. And then I did 2 stories in the first chapter for people who came predominantly for trauma issues. And I only did 2 because all the other chapters have more. I only did 2 because you're gonna see trauma throughout the whole book. And then I did do 4 stories in 1 chapter. That was the addiction chapter, because I really wanted that gender, 2 male and 2 female. Now I could have done that with every chapter, then the book was just gonna get too big. So that was just my own bias there. I wanted these stories I absolutely wanted them to reflect hope. But I wanted them to reflect diversity. So if I have 3 stories in the depression chapter, your depression is going to manifest itself differently than his depression, which is going to manifest itself differently than what your depression looks like. So the stories are very different. I wanted people to see it is complex. There isn't some one answer, or necessarily even some one modality that will, in which somebody will fully recover. So again, I wanted them to see the diversity of how it manifests. I wanted them to see the complexity, but it's also a fine line where you do not overwhelm them with the complexity. And then I wanted them to feel hope and inspiration. Multiple times in the book, I will say to them, you do not have to be to the place that the storyteller got to. You do not have to get to that place where you need inpatient treatment. And the Meadows was really fine with me saying that. At any point in your struggle, you can reach out and ask for help, and that if these people can do this, and then that you can do that. started the story, several people at the Meadows helped me find people. The alumni did, the case management people did, the executive directors did. And I interviewed 31 people, hour and a half, and then that verbal interview became a written transcript, and from that written transcript, I'd create a story, and then I'd see where the holes were. Also in the various chapters, some of the stories you get much more focused on the recovery process. Other stories get more focused on what they sort of did in the psychotherapy process that was pivotal for them. And other stories might do more on what created the problem to begin with. So we have sort of a different weighting in all the stories as well. The books can take a long time. One, I haven't hardly seen the book since last August, and it came out in March, so it spends another 7 or 8 months just improve and in design, or then you might get it back with some copy editing. I had a developmental editor who was with me yesterday because I had something similar to this yesterday, and she's from Los Angeles, and I had never met her. I'd only worked with her on Zoom, and so that was really special. And so from that, the book, Hope, my husband, who sadly has passed away now, was a marketing person, and so he was been with me in this whole journey up into this very book. And one of the things that I learned from him is you try and make a title a 1-word or a 2-word. Now, if you want to put a you can have a 3-word title. But so in my mind, I was smart enough to go with a 2-word title. And there was a woman who was doing a play, and I really liked the title of the play. It was called Accidentally Brave. It's about living with sex addiction. And so I thought, that's a good title. And I thought, well, I can't use brave, so if they're not brave, what are they? But the words hope and the word breath have been really important to me personally. I think they're absolutely vital to our life. Just take a deep breath, and you gotta find that hope someplace in there. So I came up with the word hope, and then I didn't know how I was gonna get brave in there. And that's what undaunted means to me. It means intrepid, it means persevering. It speaks to courage, it speaks to bravery. And so with that, that's how the title came into being. When you publish a book, publishers, the book is available, by the way, in Kindle. I am doing my own audio next week. I've never done that. So that's fun for me to do something I've never done before. And I'm gonna put little signs up in front of me that say, slow down, slow down. And I will do that for 20 hours. And I'll take some tea and some honey with me so I have a voice at the end of 20 hours. So the book gets sent to a publisher, and then they come up with all these designs for the cover. And I got 12 of them, and 6 of them I liked. And that's really good, because sometimes you'll get 12 and not like any of them. And they ultimately have the ultimate decision, not the author. And so I came to 6, and then I went to some of the other people on the Meadows, because the Meadows was really because of them. The book was because of them. And I had 6 different opinions of which design they liked. And then I remembered what Jack had said, you don't make decisions by committee, Claudia. And so I said, okay, this is gonna be up to me. And so I picked 2 out of the top 6, and I had a top 1. And I sent it to the publisher, and she said, give me number 2, we always need 2. And she said, but they always go with the number 1 cover, Claudia. So then she gets back to me in a couple of weeks and says, none of them went with number 1, Claudia. And they were marketing people in the book industry. They all went with you're number 2. And it was like, really? You know, I really liked my number 1. But again, from a marketing perspective. So I only share this with you because in truth, this is a better cover. But only once they did it was this a better cover. And but what I thought some of you might appreciate seeing, and I'm going to stop talking in a second and see if you have any questions, just to give you a sense of what can happen with covers. I brought you a couple different ones. This was one of the covers, the caged birds. Totally different style. This is the cover in a different color. I had it in 2 or 3 different colors. The other thing that happened is I would also get it in different fonts. As you can see, Hope does not stand out here. And there was, it says nothing about the forward vessel, which absolutely needs to be on the cover. And there were times that we put Bessel up here, and then we moved Bessel down here, and then we changed the font size, changed the color size. So I'm gonna show you my first choice. And then we're gonna put it up against the book. So the other thing that happens, okay, this was my very first choice, Undaunted Hope. So when I first saw it, the stump was black. I said, can you make it brown? And it only had 2 twigs. I said, no, we needed more hope than that. So they did multiple twigs. Metaphorically, I thought this really represented the book more than this. But I think hope is inspired clearly by the colors of this. And not everybody's gonna get the metaphor for this or get the metaphor for this as well. But I just thought some of you would appreciate sort of knowing a little bit about book publishing, the decisions that get made in this process. And the 31 people that I interviewed for the book, 10 aren't in the book. It was very painful for me to call them and thank them for the interviews. And because oftentimes there were multiple phone calls after that and said, I won't be using your story. But most of the time it was because there wasn't enough, it didn't add to the diversity of the chapter. Or there was something too extreme about it. And I thought that they will attach themselves to something being so extreme that they won't get an overall view of what depression could be, or what sex addiction could be, or what an addiction could be. The reality is, some people could have been in different chapters. I have a young man that was in my program. He came in at 25 years of age for a serious substance use disorder. He'd been actively addicted and serious addicted. I'm isolated at home now, not going to school, not working, just all the ramifications of addiction. Since he was almost 16 years of age. So he comes into the program for addiction. And there has been a trauma in his life. His mother suicided when he was almost 15 years of age. But what people didn't know is that, one, he found his mother in a suicide attempt when he was 12. Between being 12 and when she suicided, there was a divorce, and he moved with his dad. But he didn't initially move. He spent 9 months with his mom until she got a boyfriend, and then he moved. And in that course of those next couple of years, she would send him multiple texts blaming him for her despair and that she was going to take her life. The day she took her life, she did it very close to his school setting, 3 blocks away. Set herself on a railway track and sent him a text. So this boy, who's not ever used anything, has told nobody about any of these texts. They've been going on for a couple of years. Immediately begins to have flashbacks, nightmares, tells nobody, and pretty immediately, within just weeks, he's using. So it's in treatment we get this story. If we send somebody for addiction treatment, he's like, yep, he's had suicide in the family, but addiction is a primary issue here. We need to see that he gets sober. He can deal with that later. There's no way this kid's going to stay sober without doing that kind of assessment. Now, I could have put him in the trauma chapter, but I had I had to make some judgment calls. Probably my most blatant of all traumas is the woman who's in the eating disorder chapter, and I could have put her in that. And as I say, you see substance abuse throughout all of the various chapters. I have a man that is in the first chapter that has stories. His name is Carlos. Carlos came from El Salvador. And in El Salvador as a child, he grew up, what he said was middle class. They had a little bit of money, and where a lot of people in his country didn't. But it was during the Civil War, and he would have to jump across landmines and look for landmines on his way to school. He saw other children blown up.
Oh my gosh.
At 9 years of age, he was soon to be abducted and taken in as a child soldier, so his family ran. And they ran literally across the deserts, the stereotypical coyote kind of stories, in terms of smuggler coyotes, into San Diego. From there, they lived in garages, so he also went from a middle class to much more of a poverty level. He had a green card. He had joined ROTC late in high school. He had a green card. 9/11 happened. When you have a green card, you can't join the military. When 9/11 happened, with a green card, you could join the military. And that was his way for success in his life. Unfortunately, it was also during the Afghanistan war, and very quickly in his service, there was a helicopter fight where he would grab a machine gun, and that would begin his years of seeing himself as this really bad guy who killed a lot of people himself. He comes into the Meadows at 40 years of age, and this is interesting. In the service, he's in the Air Force. He takes somebody within his command to the airport, and she's going to a treatment center. She's actually coming to my program, CBC. But that doesn't mean anything to him other than he knows, she's a hot mess, as he says. He happens to be the one that picks her up 45 days later at the airport. And he said it was a totally different girl. He said, what in the world happened to you? And she told him all about treatment. He went to his commander and said, you need to send me to a treatment program. And so he came into, so this is a little bit about Carlos's story, but somebody asked me yesterday, so I thought I'd share it with you as well. How are people responding to seeing their stories written? And, I've really put on my clinical hat, and I have really tried to take care of these people because I know the impact of it. I showed them all their stories before it went into a book, but once you see it in a book, that's a whole nother thing. So he wrote, "Good morning, Claudia. I've just gotten home from Mexico and I found the package by my gate. I can't begin to tell you how much it means to me to be a part of something this huge. I read my section. It was very moving and surreal to see my life story in print. It's like everything was playing back before my eyes, but this time I didn't want to curl up in a ball and ask God why life has to be this way. I feel so liberated, like I can actually look back at all of that, just like a book, and I can put it down and come back to it without it overwhelming me. I can't really express what I expected to happen when I read it. I think a part of me was expecting a total fear and despair-filled meltdown. As it turned out, it actually helped me realize that I'd come such a long way from being the alcoholic that I was going insane and had no hope of surviving this battle. But I thank the Lord every day for having listened to my cries for help and putting all of the pieces in the right place for me to get to the Meadows and get a second chance. I also want to thank every person who has been a part of this process. If it wasn't for you, I would not be on this earth anymore. And now with the book and me becoming a therapist, and I have 3 stories out of 21 where people change careers. I have a woman who was in fashion design who became a psychotherapist. I have a woman who was in my program in the depression chapter who was in civil engineering and has become a psychotherapist. And then we have Carlos, who is in the military, who's becoming the counselor. And he said, contrast that with the life now. I can't believe how much I love life, and how it turns out that the light I used to see at the end of the tunnel was not a train heading for me. It was my dreams come to life. Yeah. And again, he just goes on to express a lot of things. And then we also had a woman that's in the book who is from Orange County, and she was invited to come today and couldn't come, and actually sent me a text this morning and just reiterated her support for all of this happening today. So that's a lot about me. It's a lot about the book. And are there any questions you'd have at all? Because otherwise, I'm going to invite you to please eat some of that food. It just smells so good. And also, I'm going to sign books, and I'm going to sign them